Back in town, whispers spread quickly. Some claimed to have heard the sheriff's harsh words and saw the Apache rise without fear. Others spoke of the man's strange calm, the way he had walked away without a glance over his shoulder. Rumors were dangerous in a place like Red Rock, where a story could twist into legend overnight. Yet even the whispers carried a chill. People didn't know his name, his history, or his intentions. All they knew was that he commanded attention without effort, and that the sheriff's confidence had taken an unexpected hit. Attention built in homes and saloons, invisible but thick. A reminder that the balance of power had shifted without ceremony. The Apache's background was a tapestry of struggle, honor, and skill. Born along harsh lands, far from the comforts of a town, he had known hardship from the start. Life had taught him early that survival required intelligence, cunning, and a steady hand. Families lost, villages burned. Betrayals endured all had shaped him into a man who understood both fear and respect, and who moved through the world with a keen eye and a controlled heart. Those who had crossed him in the past learned quickly that his silence often meant far more than any shouted threat. It was the calm before a storm that few could see coming. Red Rock, however, was a different kind of place. The town had grown slowly along a river bend filled with settlers, traders, and men who sought fortune in land or gold. Its streets were wide enough to allow horse-drawn wagons to pass, but narrow enough for neighbors to spy on one another. The sheriff ruled not only with law, but with reputation, ensuring that no one challenged his authority without consequence. Yet the Apache, unfamiliar with the town's politics, but well-versed in human nature, could see its weaknesses clearly. He observed patterns, learned who watched, who whispered, and who feared the sheriff's temper. Every glance and movement added to his understanding. A map of the town's power structures forming in his mind at night, when the town was quiet. He found a place just beyond the ridge that overlooked Red Rock. From there, he could see the sheriff's office, the saloon, the general store, and the small homes clustered along the main street. He studied the lights and shadows, the movements of those who patrolled, and the behavior of those who lingered. Every detail mattered. The Apache's past had taught him that knowledge was a weapon. And in Red Rock, information would be as valuable as any gun or knife. He was patient, waiting, letting the town reveal its secrets to him, piece by piece, like the slow turn of a chessboard. Meanwhile, the sheriff's nights were restless. Sleep came in fits, haunted by the sight of the Apache's calm eyes and the whisper of his words. "I say nothing for now." Those words repeated in the sheriff's mind like a drumbeat he could not escape. He thought of all the times he had held men in check, but the Apache had refused to respond to provocation, leaving the sheriff unbalanced. He worried that the man's silence masked something far more dangerous than anyone in Red Rock could imagine. The sheriff paced, checked his weapons, and walked the streets at irregular hours. But nothing would fill the growing unease that settled in his chest. The Apache was out there, somewhere, learning, watching, waiting. In the days that followed, small signs began to appear, subtle, almost imperceptible hints of the Apache's presence. A boot print where it shouldn't be, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of town, a fleeting figure moving with uncanny precision. The townsfolk noticed, whispered, and speculated, feeding the tension further. Children spoke in hushed tones about the man who had no name. Adults worried openly about what he might do next. And the sheriff grew more tense, his authority fraying with each passing hour. Red Rock's ordinary rhythm had been disrupted, replaced with a nervous energy that kept everyone alert. The Apache, however, did not act rashly. He understood the value of timing, of letting a story unfold until the moment demanded resolution. He remembered the lessons of his people. Power measured itself not in anger, but in patience. And a true threat was recognized, not by the size of a gun, but by the calmness of the hand that could use it. As the town moved through its daily routines, he continued to observe and plan, gathering insights without revealing his hand. He knew that a single misstep by the sheriff or a townsperson could tip the balance in unpredictable ways, and he intended to be ready when that moment arrived. The townsfolk continued with their routines, but unease shadowed every step. Farmers returned from fields earlier. Shopkeepers left their doors cracked, but not fully open. And men lingered longer in the saloon than necessary, swapping rumors and stories of the Apache. No one had seen him do anything overtly dangerous, yet his presence changed everything. Even the sheriff, in his pride, could not deny the shift in the town's atmosphere. Each glance at the empty street reminded him that control was slipping, that the man he had humiliated was neither ordinary nor to be underestimated. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, the Apache stood at the edge of the ridge again, looking down at the town. The light caught the contours of his face, and for a moment he seemed almost a part of the shadows themselves. He did not need to rush, to strike, or to speak. His presence alone altered the mood, a quiet power that promised consequences for those who underestimated him. In his mind, the town's story was already beginning to unfold. Each person a character in a larger tale that would test courage, patience, and understanding. The sheriff, meanwhile, could not sleep. He sat by the window, gun at his side, eyes fixed on the street that seemed emptier than usual. Every sound, the distant clatter of a shutter, the creak of a board, the whisper of wind set his nerves on edge. He could feel the Apache's influence even without seeing him. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men were not the ones who drew their weapons first. The sheriff wondered if he had underestimated the man completely. If pride had blinded him to a force he could neither control nor predict. The thought lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, as the town itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. And so, Red Rock moved through the days that followed with a subtle, tense rhythm. Life continued on. The surface horses were fed, goods traded. The saloon filled with the clinking of glasses, but beneath it, a quiet suspense built like a river swelling before a storm. The Apache watched, waited, and planned. The sheriff prepared, worried, and paced. The townsfolk whispered and speculated, caught between fear and curiosity. Every movement, every glance, every sound became part of a story that had only just begun. A story that would test loyalty, courage, and judgment. No one knew when the next confrontation would come, only that it was inevitable. And the Apache, patient as ever, remained a shadow in the town's peripheral vision, man without a name, without overt action, but carrying the weight of experience and the promise of consequences that no one in Red Rock could yet imagine. The tension remained unresolved, a quiet storm pressing down on every building, every person, and every secret of the town, leaving the future uncertain, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The days in Red Rock grew longer and hotter, the sun baking the streets and making the dust rise in shimmering waves. Life continued outwardly as usual. Horses were fed, wagons rolled over wooden planks, and the saloon's doors swung constantly with comings and goings. But beneath the surface, a tension had taken root that no one could ignore. The Apache's presence lingered like a shadow across the town, an invisible force that twisted ordinary moments into reminders of the unknown. Even the simplest actions, watering horses, carrying supplies, or sweeping the porch, felt heavier, as though the town itself sensed the storm on the horizon. The sheriff, stubborn as he was proud, refused to show weakness. He moved through Red Rock with practiced authority, tipping his hat to those who watched and giving orders to those who served him. Yet the unease clung to him, a low hum beneath every step. Each glance down the empty streets reminded him of the man he had humiliated, Apache, whose calm stare and measured movements had unsettled not just him but everyone in town. For the first time, he began to notice the subtle ways the townspeople changed in his presence. They spoke less freely, lingered in doorways longer, and exchanged cautious glances when he passed. His power, which had always been unquestioned, was now fragile. Among the townsfolk, suspicion and curiosity began to weave themselves into daily life. The general storekeeper whispered to the blacksmith about the Apache, wondering where he came from and why he had come to Red Rock. The women, gossiping while washing clothes at the river, spoke in hushed tones of the man who seemed to carry both danger and knowledge of the land. Even children, normally fearless in their games, kept their distance. their eyes following the figure who walked the streets without hurry, without purpose, yet commanding attention in every movement. No one knew his intentions, and that uncertainty made him more dangerous than any outlaw or bandit the town had ever faced. At the saloon, tension played out in quieter, subtler ways. The bartender, used to dealing with rowdy men and late-night trouble, noticed the shift in conversation. Patrons no longer laughed as loudly or boasted as boldly. Every story seemed tinged with fear or respect for the Apache, even if only whispered. He overheard one rancher speculate that the man could have killed dozens in his time and survived, statement that was met with nods and uneasy silence. No one had proof, of course, but the rumors spread anyway, feeding the growing apprehension. The Apache himself moved with purpose, yet not out of haste. He visited the edges of town, observing the routines of people who believed they were going about ordinary business. He watched the sheriff's patterns, noting the hours he walked, the weapons he carried, the way he interacted with the townsfolk. The Apache's past had trained him to read humans in ways most could not comprehend. He noticed fears hidden behind smiles, pride veiled as arrogance, and caution disguised as carelessness. Each detail became a piece of the puzzle, helping him understand the town without ever revealing his own hand. A subplot began to unfold among those closest to the sheriff. His deputy, a younger man eager to prove himself, started questioning the decisions of the sheriff for the first time. He noticed the unease in town, the whispers, and the subtle hints that the Apache was no ordinary visitor. One evening, while cleaning his weapon behind the sheriff's office, he spoke up. "Maybe we underestimated him, sir," he said cautiously. The sheriff waved him off, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He wanted to dismiss the warning, to cling to his sense of control, yet the unease remained. The deputy, feeling the weight of responsibility and loyalty, began keeping his own watch over the town, unsure whether the Apache was a threat or something more unpredictable. Meanwhile, the Apache learned from observing ordinary people as much as he did from watching the sheriff. A young widow running the bakery caught his attention. She was cautious, yet resilient, her life defined by necessity and subtle courage. He noticed the way she moved through town, how she offered help to those in need while avoiding conflict, and how her quiet strength contrasted with the bravado of the men who claimed to hold power. Though he never approached her, her presence in the town became a marker for him, a sign of the delicate balance he needed to navigate. Tensions escalated further when a small incident occurred near the river crossing. A wagon driver, unfamiliar with the area, took a corner too fast and nearly collided with the Apache. The man stumbled back, cursing, and the Apache's calm eyes met his. The townspeople nearby froze, sensing the unspoken weight behind that simple glance. The driver's apology came out, hurried and anxious, his face pale under the sun. The Apache said nothing, but the moment lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. A silent statement had been made. He was not a man to be provoked carelessly. And Red Rock's streets, though wide and familiar, did not belong to anyone but themselves until he chose otherwise. The sheriff, hearing of the incident later, felt his pulse quicken. He tried to frame it as a minor accident, yet the thought of anyone walking through town without fear gnawed at him. He began increasing patrols, inspecting the town more closely than ever before. Horses were checked twice daily, windows inspected, and doors bolted. Yet the feeling persisted that no precaution could fully shield them from what might come. The Apache's presence was a constant reminder that control could be an illusion, and pride could be the most dangerous trap of all. At night, the Apache sometimes moved silently through the outskirts, blending with the shadows as if they were part of him. He watched the sheriff's office, the saloon, and the homes of those who spoke of him most loudly. He did not plan immediate confrontation. He did not need to. Each step, each glance, each observed detail added to a growing understanding of the town's structure, the vulnerabilities of its people, and the weaknesses of the man who claimed authority. Red Rock was a puzzle, and he held the patience to solve it piece by piece in the center of town. Subtle conflicts began to emerge as well. Merchants debated the cost of goods and the safety of trade routes, their conversations carrying unintentional tension. Farmers argued over irrigation rights, their voices rising in ways that suggested the quiet shadow over the town had emboldened smaller disputes. The sheriff tried to mediate, to keep peace, but even he could sense the growing unrest beneath the surface. People were no longer acting solely out of routine. Fear and respect for the Apache had begun to influence decisions, alliances, and grudges, making Red Rock a town on edge. The Apache's influence extended even to the animals. Horses, naturally attuned to humans, reacted subtly to his presence. Strays and livestock moved differently when he passed, quieter, more cautious, sensing something the townspeople could not name. Dogs growled low in the distance. Cats disappeared behind fences. It was as though nature itself acknowledged his presence, reinforcing the sense of unease in every living being in and around the town. Meanwhile, the sheriff's frustration began to manifest in small, uncharacteristic mistakes. A miscounted ledger, a missed warning from a townsperson, even a slip of temper when confronted with minor disputes revealed cracks in his authority. Each mistake, though small in isolation, fed the tension that the Apache's presence had begun to cultivate. The town watched and whispered and speculated, their collective unease rising like a tide that no one could predict. Even the nights brought no relief. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, footsteps echoed differently, and the wind carried whispers of the Apache's movements across rooftops and alleys. People slept uneasily, doors bolted, windows shuttered, hearts tense. The sheriff tried to rally courage, patrolling late and testing his readiness. But the awareness of the Apache's calculated patience was always present. The man did not need to act to command attention. His mere presence had already shifted the town's balance. As the days wore on, the town began to sense a pattern. Every glance, every whisper, every small incident contributed to a growing understanding. The Apache was not here to follow the rules of Red Rock. He moved by a code that no one could read, governed by skill, experience, and an understanding of human nature far beyond ordinary men. Even the deputy, who had grown more cautious with every passing day, realized that the town's survival might depend not on gunfire or threats, but on patience, intelligence, and the careful reading of every action taken in the town. And so, Red Rock existed in a delicate tension, a town both ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath. Every character played their part in the unfolding story, the sheriff clinging to authority, the deputy struggling with loyalty and doubt, the townspeople balancing fear and curiosity, and the Apache patient, watchful, and unyielding, moving like a shadow through the lives of all around him. The conflict was no longer simply between one man and another. It had grown into a quiet battle of wills, knowledge and anticipation, a test of who could read the signs, who could act with precision, and who could survive in a town suddenly transformed by the presence of someone no one had fully understood. The tension remained unresolved. Every day, every glance, every footstep in Red Rock added to a story that had yet to reach its breaking point. The Apache's eyes watched, patient and deliberate. The sheriff's pride began to crack, and the town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when calm would no longer be possible, and the consequences of a single misjudged action would unfold in ways that no one could predict. The heat of the afternoon hung thick in Red Rock, the sun glinting off the tin roofs and burning the dust into a haze that made the town appear like it floated on waves of gold. The streets, usually filled with the chatter of merchants and the clop of horses, were quieter than usual. The tension that had been building for days now pressed down on the town like the weight of the sky itself. Even the wind seemed hesitant, carrying dust lazily across the empty sidewalks, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The sheriff rode slowly through the main street, eyes scanning every shadow, every doorway. His spurs jingled with each step, but even the familiar sound failed to reassure him. He had always known control, always relied on the unquestioned authority of his badge and presence. But the Apache's calm defiance, the way he had walked through town without fear, without deference, had shaken something deep within him. Every glance from the townsfolk reminded him that they were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The man he had humiliated had returned the attention in silence. And now, That silence was louder than any shout could ever be. In the general store, the clerk noticed the sheriff's restless movements. He watched as the lawman paused at the counter, fingering the edge of a ledger without really seeing it. People whispered to each other, voices low but urgent. Everyone in town could feel the subtle shift. The Apache had become more than a stranger, more than a shadow at the edge of their streets. He was a presence that unsettled hearts, even the hearts of those who wielded power. The town itself seemed to wait for something to happen, something inevitable. The Apache moved deliberately outside the town limits, along a dry creek bed that wound behind Red Rock, like a secret path only he seemed to know. He observed the patterns of the sheriff's patrols, the timing of trades, and the behaviors of those most likely to cause trouble in his absence. He had no immediate plan to act, yet his every movement was calculated, precise, and deliberate. In his mind, he reconstructed the town's rhythms, noting vulnerabilities and strengths alike. Every step, every glance, every pause was part of a strategy that only he understood. At night, Red Rock became a stage for the invisible tension. The saloon's doors were bolted earlier than usual. Lamps flickered in windows that were usually bright with the glow of families settling in for the evening. Children whispered about the Apache, unsure whether to fear or respect him. The adults, too, felt the unease, keeping quiet conversations behind closed doors. Even the deputy, who had been growing cautious, found himself watching the edges of town long after the sheriff had gone to bed. There was an unspoken understanding that the balance of Red Rock had shifted. One man's presence had changed everything. A small incident at the river crossing further escalated the suspense. A herd of cattle, spooked by something no one saw, bolted toward the town. The Apache appeared quietly at the edge of the herd, guiding them away with gestures so subtle that only those closest could notice. By the time the sheriff arrived, the cattle were calm, and the townsfolk whispered in awe. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone understood. The Apache did not need to confront with force to make his mark. His intelligence, his timing, and his quiet authority were far more dangerous than brute strength. The sheriff, despite wanting to claim victory or maintain control, could not ignore the impression the man had left. Meanwhile, a subplot of rivalry simmered between the sheriff and a local rancher. The rancher had long sought influence over Red Rock, believing the sheriff's authority left cracks he could exploit. With the Apache's presence complicating matters, the rancher's whispers grew louder, feeding distrust among townsfolk and heightening the sense of unrest. Small disputes over land, livestock, and trade began to feel like larger threats. The sheriff's frustration increased with each passing day. But the Apache watched silently, letting the town reveal its secrets, its weaknesses, and its fears. The Apache's patience became a weapon. He observed the patterns of human behavior, with the same precision he once used in survival far from civilization. He noted who feared the sheriff most, who acted boldly despite danger, and who might unknowingly provoke chaos. Each observation informed his understanding of Red Rock, turning a town of ordinary people into a network of opportunities, threats, and vulnerabilities. He understood the power of timing, the difference between confrontation and observation, action and restraint. His presence alone made the town reconsider its assumptions about strength and authority. The sheriff, meanwhile, began making small, uncharacteristic mistakes. Orders were given and forgotten, patrols overlooked, and the pride that had long defined him started to waver. He caught himself noticing things he should have ignored: how the townsfolk looked when they thought no one was watching, the way doors were bolted, and the subtle signals of fear or caution in everyday behavior. Every missed detail reminded him that control in Red Rock was not as absolute as he had once believed. And all of this, he knew, was because of the Apache. As the days passed, subtle challenges began to emerge. The Apache's calm defiance seemed to embolden some townspeople while intimidating others. A young stable hand, inspired by curiosity and rumor, attempted to test the stranger, only to be quietly corrected by the Apache's measured gaze. The boy returned to work, shaken but wiser. The townsfolk who had watched learned quickly that the man was not to be provoked without consequence. The message was clear. He acted not out of malice, but out of a code that none could predict and few could understand. Even the sheriff's deputy began to feel the pressure. He had long admired the sheriff's authority and believed in the structure of law in Red Rock. But the Apache's presence challenged every assumption he had about control, power, and fear. He began watching more carefully, questioning more quietly, and feeling the unease that gripped the town. He realized that loyalty alone could not secure safety, that courage alone could not maintain peace. Strategy, patience, and understanding were now the measures of survival in a place that had grown stranger by the hour. Rumors began to ripple through Red Rock like wildfire. Whispers about the Apache's past, battles fought, enemies avoided, escapes survived fueled both awe and fear. No one could verify the tales, yet the mere possibility of their truth was enough to unsettle the town. Even those who doubted the stories felt a deep respect for the man who moved with calm precision, whose eyes seemed to know more than anyone should, and whose silence carried a weight stronger than any gunfire. The air itself seemed charged, and even ordinary interactions were now tinged with caution. A single night the tension reached a near breaking point. The sheriff's patrols crossed paths with the Apache near the outskirts of town, and for the first time, the lawman noticed the full weight of the man he had humiliated. The Apache did not speak, did not make any sudden moves, yet the sheriff felt the intensity of his presence like a physical force pressing against him. Shadows stretched long across the dirt road, and the wind carried the faintest whisper of movement. The townsfolk who observed from a distance held their breath. Every step, every glance, every silence was charged with meaning. The town's other subplots intertwined with the growing tension. A merchant worried about missed deliveries, fearing the disruption caused by rumors of the Apache. Families debated whether it was safe to leave the town at night, their conversations tinged with fear and uncertainty. The young widow at the bakery continued her cautious routine, her resilience undimmed, yet she too noticed the subtle change in every face, every glance, every word. Red Rock had become a place where ordinary life was measured against the quiet presence of a man who could alter the rhythm of everything simply by existing. The Apache, aware of every nuance, did not act rashly. He understood the value of anticipation, of letting fear and respect ferment until the moment demanded action. He watched the sheriff, the deputy, and the townsfolk, seeing their weaknesses and strengths, calculating probabilities, and waiting for the inevitable moment when the calm could no longer be maintained. Every interaction, every misstep, every whispered rumor was part of a pattern he could read, like the movements of water tracing the shape of a riverbed. The tension reached its peak when a shipment of supplies arrived from a neighboring town. Wagons rolled slowly into Red Rock, and the usual exchange of goods became an event charged with unease. Every cart, every driver, every crate was a reminder of vulnerability. Eyes flickered toward the outskirts, toward the Apache's shadowy presence, and hearts beat faster with anticipation. The sheriff, armed with authority and pride, tried to assert control over the scene. But even he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down. The Apache watched silently, as always, letting the tension rise until it seemed tangible, almost suffocating. By the end of that day, Red Rock was on edge like never before. The townsfolk, the sheriff, and the deputy all felt it, the sense that everything could erupt at any moment. Rumors, whispers, and shadows had transformed ordinary streets into a web of tension, anticipation, and fear. The Apache's presence had reshaped the town entirely. Each person's movement, every glance, every word was now part of a growing story that had yet to reach its climax. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across Red Rock. Horses whinnied in the distance. Doors creaked on their hinges, and the wind whispered through empty streets. The Apache stood just beyond the town limits, silent and watchful, his dark eyes fixed on the buildings, the people, and the sheriff, who still clung to a fragile sense of control. Every moment was drawn taut. The threads of tension stretched so tight that a single misstep could unravel everything.
Ow.
Red Rock held its breath. The sheriff, though unaware, felt the edge of the storm closing in. And the Apache, patient, deliberate, and unyielding, waited for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. Everything was ready to collide, yet nothing had yet moved. The tension, thick and unbroken, left the town suspended between fear and anticipation, each heartbeat counting down to the moment when the calm would finally break. The tension in Red Rock reached a peak one evening when the sun bled crimson across the horizon, casting the streets in long, twisting shadows. The townsfolk moved cautiously, every footstep louder than usual, every whisper sharper than it should have been. The sheriff paced in front of the office, gun holstered but hand brushing the grip as if that small comfort might somehow control the unknown. His pride, once steady and unwavering, had been chipped away by days of observation, rumors, and the silent power of a man who refused to bow to authority. The Apache, still a quiet presence at the edge of town, had taught Red Rock a lesson it had not realized it needed. That evening, the Apache entered the main street for the first time since the tension had begun. His movements were deliberate, measured, every step echoing in the ears of those who watched. Children peeked from behind doorways, adults held their breath, and the deputy followed cautiously from a distance, unsure what would unfold. The sheriff stood tall, forcing a smile, though his eyes betrayed the unease he could no longer hide. He had been challenged, humiliated, and unsettled. Yet he had to maintain the facade of control for the town's sake. The Apache stopped in the center of town, calm and composed. He did not raise his hand in threat, nor did he speak sharply. Instead, his gaze swept over the buildings, the people, and finally rested on the sheriff. "I have come for no trouble," he said quietly, yet the words carried the weight of authority and experience. The town exhaled, though only slightly, as a tense silence fell. The sheriff's pride bristled at being addressed with such calm confidence, but he forced himself to meet the Apache's gaze. The deputy, standing slightly behind the sheriff, noticed the change immediately. The fear and curiosity that had haunted the town now mingled with a sense of relief. The Apache's calm presence was not a threat, but a quiet assertion of boundaries. He had come to show that power was not always loud or brash. Sometimes it was measured, deliberate, and guided by understanding. For the first time, the sheriff began to see the wisdom in restraint, in observing before acting, and in recognizing that respect earned quietly could outweigh authority enforced with force as the days that followed unfolded. The Apache became more than just a shadow at the edge of Red Rock. He moved through the town with purpose, helping when needed but always careful not to disrupt the delicate balance. A small fire in the blacksmith's shop was extinguished with his guidance. A stalled wagon was redirected before it blocked the main street, and a frightened horse was calmed with a subtle gesture that only someone who understood the language of animals could give. The townsfolk began to see him not as a stranger or a threat, but as a quiet protector, a man whose presence reminded them that courage and skill could come in forms other than bluster and bravado. The young widow who ran the bakery found herself offering bread to the Apache one morning, her curiosity overcoming her caution. He accepted with a simple nod, a gesture that carried no arrogance, only respect. Over time, their brief exchanges became small threads in the town's tapestry, moments that reminded everyone that even in tension, life could continue with humility and care. The Apache never sought attention, never demanded gratitude, yet his actions left a lasting impression on all who observed. The sheriff gradually began to adjust his approach as well. He recognized that his previous methods of asserting dominance had not served him well, and that pride alone could blind even the most experienced lawman. With the Apache's example, he began listening more, observing quietly and considering actions before executing them. The deputy, too, learned from the shifts in power, understanding that courage required more than force and that wisdom often outweighed quick action. Red Rock slowly began to find its balance again, not through fear, but through mutual respect and cautious cooperation. The rivalry with the local rancher, once a source of constant tension, began to ease as well. The Apache's quiet presence reminded the townsfolk that cooperation, not conflict, was essential to survival and prosperity. Disputes over land and resources were mediated with more patience and understanding. The sheriff, learning from the Apache's example, stepped in to settle disagreements, not through intimidation but by listening and guiding. Slowly, the town's rhythm returned, steadier and more resilient than before. One evening, as the town settled into quiet routines, the Apache walked to the ridge overlooking Red Rock. He watched the lights twinkle in the windows, listened to the distant clatter of the river, and observed the subtle movements of people moving through their evening chores. The town had changed under his quiet influence. Fear had given way to respect, suspicion to cautious trust, intention to a shared understanding that strength could take many forms. He remained a silent guardian, a man whose past had taught him patience, observation, and restraint. His presence was no longer a shadow, but a quiet reminder of balance in a world often ruled by pride and haste. The sheriff, standing outside his office that night, finally allowed himself a deep breath. The weight of uncertainty and fear that had pressed on his chest for so long began to ease. He knew that the Apache was no ordinary man, and that his own pride had nearly cost him and the town dearly. Yet he also understood that lessons had been learned, trust cautiously rebuilt, and boundaries respectfully observed. The deputy, nearby, felt a sense of relief as well, realizing that loyalty and courage must be tempered with understanding and patience. Even the townsfolk, once tense and wary, began to carry themselves differently. Conversations returned to normal, though now there was a subtle undercurrent of awareness that had not existed before. The Apache's presence had taught them that the world was larger and more unpredictable than they had imagined, that not all strength needed to be loud, and that sometimes the quietest figure in the town carried the greatest impact. Children returned to play in the streets, though now with a glance toward the edges of town, a nod to the man whose calm had shaped their days. The Apache eventually moved beyond Red Rock, leaving quietly as he had arrived, without fanfare or ceremony. His footsteps left no trace, yet his influence lingered. The town had been tested by patience, observation, and the quiet weight of presence. The sheriff had learned humility, the deputy had learned prudence, and the townsfolk had learned the value of respect that did not need to be demanded. Red Rock, once a town defined by authority and pride, had been reshaped by understanding, caution, and the quiet courage of a man who refused to be underestimated. In the weeks that followed, the town reflected on the lessons left behind. The sheriff often sat quietly in his office, remembering the calm gaze of the Apache and the way silence could carry more power than any shout. The deputy carried those lessons into his daily work, observing first, acting second, and learning to read the subtle signals of the people around him. The townsfolk, for their part, moved through their lives with a renewed awareness of the balance between courage, respect, and humility. Stories of the Apache spread quietly beyond Red Rock, whispered in neighboring towns and trading posts. People spoke of the man who had arrived without challenge, which shifted the rhythm of an entire town through observation, patience, and subtle action. He became a figure of legend, not for violence, but for wisdom, skill, and the reminder that sometimes the quietest man carried the greatest power. Red Rock itself never forgot. The town's streets, once ordinary, now seemed imbued with the memory of a presence that had shaped its people. Windows shone a little brighter, conversations carried a little more thoughtfulness, and every step through the streets carried a subtle awareness that power could be measured in many ways. Life returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal, tempered by lessons learned under the watchful eyes of a man who had entered silently and left a lasting mark in the end. Red Rock thrived, not through conflict, but through understanding. Pride had been tempered by respect, fear had been replaced with cautious trust, and the town emerged stronger for having faced the quiet force of someone who had taught them that influence did not always come with noise. The Apache became a part of their collective memory, a symbol of patience, wisdom, and quiet power that shaped the way they lived, worked, and interacted with one another. The sheriff, standing at the edge of the town one evening, looked across the horizon and felt the lessons settle in his mind. Authority alone was fragile, and respect earned quietly could carry more weight than a gun or a badge. The deputy, following suit, walked a little taller, wiser than before. knowing that observation and patience were as vital as courage and loyalty. The townsfolk, too, moved forward with a sense of calm awareness, understanding that the quiet presence of a man could leave a mark deeper than any challenge or confrontation. Red Rock returned to its rhythm, but it carried a memory that would shape it for years to come. A town once defined by pride and authority had been transformed by the lessons of humility, respect, and patience. The Apache, though gone, left behind a legacy that could not be erased. Every corner, every street, every life in Red Rock carried a piece of that quiet wisdom, a reminder that true strength often speaks softly, moves deliberately, and changes the world without needing recognition. And so the town endured wiser and steadier, carrying forward the quiet but lasting influence of the man who had walked through its streets without fear, without demand, and without expectation. Red Rock had been tested, shaped, and renewed not by violence, but by presence, patience, and the understanding that the most powerful lessons often come from those who speak the least and observe the most. The story of that time lingered in hearts, in whispers, and in the rhythm of daily life. A memory of how one man could quietly redefine an entire town.